Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
One day after the 11th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we begin the show by talking about newly disclosed documents that provide further evidence the Bush administration ignored repeated warnings about Osama bin Laden's plans to attack the United States. Writing in the New York Times, journalist and author Kurt Eichenwald reports the Bush administration dismissed a number of warnings of an al-Qaeda attack in the United States beginning in the spring of 2001, instead focusing on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Eichenwald writes, quote, "The neoconservative leaders who had recently assumed power at the Pentagon were warning the White House that the CIA had been fooled. According to the theory, bin Laden was merely pretending to be planning an attack to distract the administration from Saddam Hussein, whom the neoconservatives saw as a greater threat," end quote.
Well, to talk about the significance of these findings, we're joined by the author himself, Kurt Eichenwald, an award-winning journalist, contributing editor at Vanity Fair. His op-ed in the New York Times yesterday is called "The Deafness Before the Storm." His latest book, 500 Days, Secrets and Lies in the Terror Wars.
One of the most interesting accounts in your book is of President Bush trying to persuade, then President Bush trying to persuade French President Jacques Chirac to support U.S. military action in Iraq. You write that Bush said to Chirac, quote, "Jacques, you and I share a common faith. You're Roman Catholic, I'm Methodist, but we are both Christians committed to the teachings of the Bible. We share one common Lord." Bush goes on to say, quote, "Gog and Magog are at work in the Middle East. Biblical prophecies are being fulfilled. This confrontation is willed by God, who wants to use this conflict to erase his people's enemies before a new age begins," end quote. Can you elaborate on that?
That was a very interesting day when I heard that. This was a phone call. At that point, Chirac had been expressing a great deal of doubt about the intelligence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. His doubts, obviously, were well placed. And Bush was trying to get a unified unified effort behind getting a resolution from the UN and then for military action. And Chirac was not being particularly cooperative for the very reason he didn't trust the intelligence. And so there's this phone call, and Bush is giving many reasons why France should become part of it, why Chirac should be joining in. And he's not having a lot of success. And suddenly you shift into this religious conversation. And Chirac's response to this was, he gets off the phone, and other people have been in on the call, and he looks at his staff and says, "Does anyone know what he was talking about?" And his administration, someone there reaches out to an expert on the Bible in Switzerland. And this person, because it's like, what is Gog and Magog? And this person writes up a report for, I just say this and it's surreal. He writes a report for the French president explaining these biblical terms that were cited by the President of the United States in this national security conversation. And Gog and Magog are from two books of the Bible, one the book of Ezekiel and one the book of Revelation, and it is central elements in the apocalyptic the Armageddon concept. And so Chirac's response when he reads this is, I'm dealing with a fanatic, and I'm not going to make national security decisions for France based on someone, the president's interpretation of the Bible.
Good evening from New York. At a meeting with Palestinian leaders in June 2003, then President Bush reportedly having claimed that God told him to go to war. Mr. Bush reported as having said, quote, "God would tell me, George, go and fight those terrorists in Afghanistan, and I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq, and I did." Our fifth story on the countdown. It turns out that God received a rather hefty assist from Donald Rumsfeld. Newly released memos showing that Mr. Bush's defense secretary, having placed on the cover of his daily reports to the president biblical passages and corresponding war imagery that carefully framed the mission in Iraq as nothing less than a Christian crusade, what another faith might call a jihad. Mr. Rumsfeld apparently having left nothing to chance, not only often having hand-delivered to the White House his daily top-secret briefings for President Bush, but also having spiffed them up with the cover pages that matched photos from the previous days' war efforts with scripture from the Bible. Among the examples, March 17, 2003, 2 days before the invasion, servicemen praying, their heads bowed before their rifles, quote, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us? Here I am, Lord, send me," Isaiah 6, verse 8. April 7, 2003, as U.S. forces launched their assault on Baghdad, a screen grab of Saddam Hussein on Iraqi TV, quote, "It is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men," 1 Peter 2, verse 15. April 8, 2003, one day before the fall of Iraq's capital city, an American tank passing beneath Baghdad's Hands Victory Monument in what is now part of the U.S. enclave called the Green Zone. Quote, "Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith," Isaiah 26, verse 2. GQ's Robert Draper reporting that at least one Muslim analyst at the Pentagon having been greatly offended by the cover pages, others having been privately concerned about what the fallout might have been if those images had been leaked during a war against an Islamic nation. When some actually took the trouble to complain, no small thing in the Bush administration, they were told that the practice would continue because Rumsfeld, President Bush, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, all appreciated the cover pages. GQ also reporting that the cover pages were not Secretary Rumsfeld's direct invention. Instead, they were the brainchild of the Pentagon's Director of Intelligence, Major General Glenn Schaffer. Nor were they even the Defense Secretary's style, Mr. Rumsfeld not being one to flaunt his own religious views. It was, however, President Bush's style, Mr. Rumsfeld, writes Draper, likely having viewed the scripture as a way to make a personal connection with his president. Time now to call in our own political analyst, Richard Wolff. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
I've seen a lot of interpretation of this as proselytizing, as I used that term earlier about kind of combining in an unacceptable fashion religion and government. But it's actually a little more cynical than that, isn't it? I mean, whatever you think of Bush's faith or its relevance to governance or war, wasn't Rumsfeld basically exploiting it?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to salute Robert Draper and GQ magazine because they've really filled a very important piece that's been missing in the puzzle all along. Why invade Iraq? Why stick with a war that was going disastrously wrong? Religious faith and this cynical, manipulative appeal to religious faith is clearly a big part of it. And yes, it's exploitative. We knew at the time, those of us covering the White House, that one of the tactics Rumsfeld used to use was to portray his policy proposals to the president as being bold, on the idea that anything that was bold the president would sign up to. Well, here we have something frankly more shocking and troubling, this idea that there was this religious infusion. Now, we know Rumsfeld didn't feel it, but he was clearly exploiting the faith aspect of this president. And one thing to remind ourselves, though, the president had the opportunity to say no to any of this, and he wasn't just being manipulated by Rumsfeld. He was also being manipulated by Cheney, who, of course, was the one-time protege.
They hope to establish a violent political utopia across the Middle East, which they call a caliphate, where all would be ruled according to their hateful ideology. Osama bin Laden has called the 9/11 attacks, in his words, a great step towards the unity of Muslims and establishing the righteous caliphate. This caliphate would be a totalitarian Islamic empire encompassing all current and former Muslim lands, stretching from Europe to North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Al-Qaeda intends to impose its rule in every land that was a home for Islam, from Spain to Iraq. This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. This group and its leader, a person named Osama bin Laden, are linked to many other organizations in different countries, including the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. And tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands on the Taliban. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your land. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen. It may include dramatic strikes, visible on TV, and covert operations, secret even in success. We will starve terrorists of funding, turn them one against another, drive them from place to place, until there is no refuge or no rest. And we will pursue nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.